Okay, good to go. So, apologies, hola. That's about limiting my Spanish. I'll have a few more words, I hope. I know how to order beer at least, so I've got all the things I need to know. I've got some of the slides with titles in Spanish. If you've got any questions, we've got plenty of time to cover that today. So I want to talk to you about test automation and why it's not only for developers, why admins can also do test automation. So we're going to talk about the different ways you can do test automation and what does that mean to your QA team, okay? It doesn't put them out of a job. What other testing can they do to add value to your environment or your application? So there's a problem, and the problem is what we call the regression gap. So if you've worked on any Salesforce orgs and you've done that first nice greenfield project, and I was a consultant myself for quite a lot of years, but on Salesforce about 7 years, and I also had products on Salesforce for about 3 years as well. So version 1, it's all great. Your users are going to test things. They're probably going to test things quite thoroughly because they've never seen Salesforce before. They're even going to test all the things you don't need to test. They're going to test all those new buttons that just work, okay? They're going to test the login page, but it works. You don't need to test that. But you get really good user engagement on that version 1. And then if you're a consulting company or you're an internal admin, you get project phase 2 because the customers realized Salesforce is such an easy platform and you deliver your projects on time. They say, can we do this? Can we do this new dispatch note functionality? Yeah, we can do that in Salesforce. Can we have a new integration? Yeah, we can do that in Salesforce. But they only want to pay for that extra piece of work. Okay? They don't want to pay for you to test everything you've done before. So you build the new piece of functionality. They probably test that quite well. But you've got your regression gap. The stuff in pink is what you did before. Does that still work? Have you added a validation rule that's broken something you did before? And how are you going to test that? And what we see is most Salesforce orgs mature over time. You do continual changes generally. And so that problem is getting bigger and bigger. That regression gap is getting bigger and bigger over time. So to a point where it's far more work to fix what you've got than to build anything new. Now, we can close that gap. Now, typically on a lot of projects, what you might do is allocate extra time for testing. So in your first version, you might have done all the testing at the end because you didn't have anything to test. When you start doing version 2, you can test as you go through. So if you're using an agile methodology, you may have a special sprint just for testing, okay, before you put anything in production. So you can do that, but that's really going to slow down your release. That extra sprint or those extra time that you're giving your QA team, your admins and developers, what are they going to do? Okay? They're burning cycles, maybe fixing bugs. There's a downturn in their productivity. But that QA resource becomes a blocker, and they're under a lot of pressure to sign off that release so it can go into production. So if you consume that QA time with just regression testing, they're spending less time testing the important things and making sure that there's nothing that's been forgotten. There's no gaps in the application. And as you build up your application over time, that's not scalable. At what point do you need a second QA person or a third or a fourth to do the testing on everything you've got before? It's also not very good for that QA resource because it's really boring testing, okay? I can tell you this. It's how many people here test their own work? Come on. Okay, 2? Really? So we do testing. We do as little as possible, yeah? I used to be a developer. I had to write unit tests. I hated it. And if I could get someone else to write them for me, I would do that. It's the same for admins. You test something, you go through different flows, different processes, process builder. It's really tedious in a number of different scenarios to test, and we don't like doing it. It's not interesting for the QA person instead. So instead of doing it manually, can we automate that testing? Can we make it so we can just run it and say, here's the results? And the answer is yes. And there's multiple ways we can do that. Before we talk about the different ways, I want to talk to you about what I mean by test automation. So the quote here, the practice of running repeatable tests automatically. Now the word repeatable is underlined. I could use a tool, you can get things free from the internet, that will log everything you do on a screen, record it, and let you play it back time and again. That's fantastic, but that's only going to work in the org you've recorded it in. It's not going to work when you push it into your UAT sandbox. It's not going to work in production. If you make a slight change, you have to re-record the whole script. It's not really repeatable. It's not robust. So if you can do test automation, you need to think about the benefits you're going to get from that. So one of the biggest benefits is consistency. If you have a set of tests you've scripted or recorded, you're going to get consistency. You're testing the same things every time because you press a button and wait for the results. And that's reducing the risk of your deployments. It's also going to accelerate that regression time. So we're no longer having our QA person in our sprints spending lots of time doing regression testing. They can focus on more meaningful testing, so that QA person is no longer a blocker. And because you've made that hands-off for that QA resource, they can spend more time on much more meaningful pieces of work. And some of you might think, well, that's what QA is for. It's for regression, isn't it? Well, I tend to disagree with that. And if any of you know Cheryl Feldman, one of the MVPs and user group leaders in the US, she sent this tweet last year. QA is an art. If anyone tells you different, they have never truly done QA. Coming up with all the scenarios, thinking of ways to potentially break something is a true art. And I totally agree with that, okay? I said to someone earlier, I don't get angry when QA people find bugs. I get angry with my developers for writing them, okay? And developers don't like fixing bugs, so don't write them. And Gaurav was actually at our session at Dreamforce where we did something similar to this, and he stood up at the end and said, hey, that's me. I was at the bottom of that. So he said one of the worst interns he ever had was an asset at QA because she couldn't follow directions and would break things in totally unimaginable ways. That's a user, isn't it? That's exactly what users do. If they can break it and find a way not to use what you've written, they will. So what we can do is give the QA resource time to do something called exploratory testing. Have any of you heard of exploratory testing before or done it? No? Okay, so think of this. You're giving your tester free rein, but you want to limit the scope of what they're doing. So you come up with a test charter and say to them something like, Service Console, go for it. Okay? Just want you to test Service Console. That's all we have to agree is what is the scope of what you're going to do and how long are we going to do it. Spend 30 minutes, spend 1 hour, spend 2 hours, but time box how long they're going to spend trying to break your Service Console instance, okay? And the key here is low documentation. So they may write things up on a whiteboard, they may pop it down on a piece of paper or type it in on a Google Sheet. It doesn't matter. What's key is they just make notes of things they found that didn't seem right. And that can be usability. All the required fields. Oh, one required field's at the bottom of the page. Why have you done that? Okay? Putting things together, thinking of usability, but also thinking about things that the user shouldn't do. So not following a script, how can I break this page? So what happens if I press cancel? What happens if I don't put an account ID in? Okay? So lots of different ways you can do that. And once you've documented all those things, once you've encouraged that out-the-box thinking, they need to sit down with the developers and look through, because not everything they find will be a genuine bug. Okay? They will find things that if I do this, and Control Z and Control Y and Control X, it breaks. Yeah, that's not really going to happen in production. So prioritize what they come back with, decide what's important, decide what's realistic. Okay. So just to summarize that problem, there's a gap with regression testing we looked at, and that gets worse over time. The more releases you do, the more deployments, that regression gap is getting bigger and bigger. But you can close that with some type of automation strategy. And if you do that, you're going to get that consistency, and you're going to accelerate your testing. You're going to focus on what you've built that's new. If you can do automation, you're going to get rid of dull tasks. You're going to motivate that team member, okay? And you're also going to get to more valuable work, get better feedback on your developments. Now, there are a number of solutions, okay? It's not just one thing. I'm not saying Provar is the solution for everyone. For some people, they write code. Now, I used to be a developer. I don't like looking at this, right? I can work out that it's driving a login page. I can see it's filling in a username and a password from an Excel file, thanks to the comment. I wouldn't have known the Excel file without that. And I can see it's going to then click a button and wait some time. That's all this script is doing. That's all that just to do a login page. Now, lots of companies do this, use Selenium as a framework with Java or PHP, Perl, etc., Node.js. And that can work. If you've got a very development-heavy organization and you're happy for developers to do this work, that's totally fine, okay? But they will need to keep maintaining it. It's not transparent. So as an admin, you see that. You can't really read, or even an architect can't always read that and understand what's being covered, what's being tested, what are the results. It's also extremely brittle when you test that way. So your code that you've written will probably work, like they'll record and playback in the org which it was written against. But it doesn't work when you then run it in another org. So I employed some testers a couple of years ago. I was on a customer project. And we spent 3 months just doing basic sales, lead, opportunity, account, contact. So all the CRUD methods, testing that, using one of those frameworks. And we were using Classic at the time, and then the business decided we were ready to move to Lightning. So what happened to all those test cases? We had to throw them all away, and our testers said they couldn't actually write test cases for Lightning. So that time I bought Provar, then luckily Provar bought me, so that was good for me. The other thing around people doing that test automation, they don't really know Salesforce. The script doesn't know what it's doing. It's just driving a web page. It could be anything. There's no intelligence built into that test case we just saw. And as I said, Lightning migration, go back to square one, start again. So isn't it good, though, if we've got Salesforce, 80% of your development is probably configured, okay? We do not want a code solution, we want a click solution ideally. So if we're employing people to do things declaratively, why don't we test them the same way? So there are other tools. Provar's not the only tool you can use. It's the only one specifically Salesforce, but Provar is a point and click test automation tool that lets you interact with a page that you recognize and interact with the fields that you do if you were testing manually. And we can capture that, and on the right it's interacting, it's capturing that field. I'm putting in the value, or I'm putting in a function, or I'm putting in a variable, if you want to get advanced, that I want to test against. And I can do that for both setting values, asserting values, and basically have a very well-documented, I hope you find, script that tells you, on this screen do this, on this screen do that, check for this. And we can even hook those results up into Salesforce if we wanted, or we can push them into Jira or ALM, whatever you want to do. But we put a free app on the App Exchange for test results. You don't have to buy Provar, you don't have to be a Provar customer. And basically it's just two custom objects, okay? A test run and a test case object. And then you can have some nice dashboards showing over time how is our testing going, okay? And how is it working against different browsers? How is it working against different environments? Which of our test cases are most brittle, or which areas of our application are the ones that are failing most often? And hopefully they're the ones we're changing the most often. So, starting the summary now, there's different ways to choose a test approach. So the first one I'm putting up here is looking at the level of customization. Okay, so how customized are you from out the box? And the higher you go, the more you move away from manual testing. But manual testing definitely has a place. Okay? It's definitely worth doing in some cases. So against that, you need to think about how frequently you're making changes. If you do a project once for a customer and that's it, and Salesforce is going to stay exactly as you configured it, there's no benefit in doing any kind of automated testing. You're never going to get to that phase 2. But there's a point on that line where you have to think about either a coded automation or a declarative automation. And I think if it's the level of customization is high and the frequency of change is high, you should definitely be looking at something declarative, like Provar. Same chart, different way of thinking about it. So if your business is a different way, you can think about the complexity. So you may have lots of configuration, but actually you can cope with that because it's easy, it's within your skill set. But do you have lots of code? If you've got lots of code already, you're already employing developers. So do you know what? Coded automation is fine. You've already got the resources to do that. But if you have very few lines of code, you don't want to hire a developer to do your test automation. So you want to be thinking about the test automation, or again, what point manual testing no longer works for you. So really just to put them side by side, it's the same matrix. Just think about the different ways you can measure that testing and the benefits from it. So if you want to do test automation, the first thing you should do is do a vendor comparison, okay? So in order to do that, you should list out your requirements from that tool. So is it mobile testing? Is it testing just Salesforce? Is it testing Salesforce and your community website? What are the things you want to test? What does it need to do? And prioritize them, which are the most important, because not all the tools have equal features. Think about whether that tool is aligned to the Salesforce roadmap. So with Summer 19 about to come out, will they patch their product for Summer 19 to keep it working? Or will you have to do the patching yourself? There's a checklist, so you'll know the Salesforce Ben blog. So lots of guest blogs on there. There's a guest blog on there from one of my colleagues, actually. What is test automation in Salesforce? Why does it matter? So there's a really long checklist on there, much more detail on this subject. When you go to those vendors and ask them to do demos, fine, but don't ask for just a standard demo. Ask them to give a demo that represents what you want to see. So don't have a Sales Cloud demo if you're a Service Cloud user. Okay? If you want to see communities tested, ask them to do that. Ask them if they'll do a proof of concept. So a proof of concept would typically be you give them access to one of your sandboxes, doesn't have to have data in, and you write some test scenarios to say, this is what I want to see tested from A to B, and this is what we want to validate at the end of it. So you don't pick something simple, pick something you think is hard to do or is very cumbersome to do manually. And they should be doing that for free for you. They should configure their product and demonstrate it back to you to show the benefits. Okay, just to conclude. So we've seen regression testing as a gap. We can close it with automation. Therefore, we can get that consistency. We can accelerate the testing, and we can free up those testers. And we can also see that while we used to have code to do this until quite recently, there are a number of declarative tools such as Provar, a number of record tools, lots of things you can use, and they're easier to read, easier to understand the tests that are written, and look at the results. Think about whether they are a Salesforce expert or whether they do generic testing across their whole company. And for some companies, you want a tool that works across all your products, not just for Salesforce. Look at the maintenance cost of that tool. What ROI is it going to provide you? Okay? Is it going to save you that QA person? Is it going to save you having a developer doing testing and employing, unfortunately, a cheaper resource being a manual tester to do it? And is it going to solve technical challenges for you on the way? For example, when you want to move to Lightning, if you haven't already, or whatever comes after Lightning. Okay, so to do this, review at your company. The next steps, think about how much time you spend doing regression testing today. Try and measure that. Try and measure the impact of it on you. How quickly are you making changes to that org? Okay, and what's holding you back making them faster? Is it resources? Is it the testing? Is it the developers? Is it the business not able to sign off requirements? Quite often it's that. And then you can start thinking about which testing approach is right for you. So it's okay to be manual, okay? Totally on board with manual testing. It's how I do my changes. But do you need an automation strategy? And if you do, then decide if you're going to code it or whether you're going to use a declarative tool. If you want to know more about Provar, we've got the stand here today. We're probably going to shut it during the closing keynote because we want to find out who's won the demo jam. But we'll be back on it from 6 o'clock, hopefully when the drinks come out. You can go on our website and find out more. There's case studies, there's lots of videos. Any questions before we conclude? No questions? We've got a few minutes.
Can we try these for free with the samples?
Yes, so we do have the ability to give out trials. So our trials tend to be on an org we've chosen, so free trials, select. For the POCs, we'd use one of your sandboxes and our consultants would write the tests. So the reason for POC is twofold. One, we want to know if we're the right tool for you, because it won't work for everyone. And you need to know it works for you as well. So it needs to be sort of a two-way street if you want to go into detail on your org. But if you just want to use a standard dev edition org, we provide a trial that you can use on an Amazon workspace, pre-configured. Any other questions? Okay. Do people want to see Provar in action in the time left? You want to see a live demo? Yeah, I was warned that might happen. I think the Zoom recording's only going to get the top half of this. So what we see here is Provar Test Builder running. And I think this is summer 19. Oh no, that one's winter 19. Let me have a look. We'll stick on the good old winter 19. So here we've got a fairly standard org. One of the things Provar does is other tools you have to do every single click. We don't need to do that. So we'll start recording at the point at which you want to start testing, and we'll build the script up to that. So if I pre-select this opportunity record, and I want to record from the edit button, what we're going to do here is it's identified the layout, it knows the opportunity view screen, it knows the field, it's the edit button, but it's intelligent about Salesforce. It knows all the other items on the page, buttons, list views, etc. And it's predicted that as it's a button, you probably want to click it, but it might be what you want to do is do a read assert. You might be doing multi-language testing, so you might want to check it's been translated correctly. And at any point, I can take screenshots. And if I do that, it's then copied that down, it's saved it. I don't have to record that step again. I can reuse that. So it's going to click the edit in this case. It's going to redraw the screen because Salesforce is reaction to that edit being clicked. And we see it's opened the edit opportunity page. And on here, I can do things. So I can click on this. I can add that to my test case and change the name if I want to. So again, it knows at the field level. I can interact with pick lists, date fields, any of those items, okay? And I can interact with the buttons as well. So it's quite easy to see how I can interact with that. I'm just going to add the cancel to the test case. Now, it's more we can do than just use standard Salesforce. It wouldn't be very good if that's all we could do. So if you've got Lightning components, if you've got Visualforce, or you've been using the Lightning App Builder, again, here we've got a path. So I want to interact with the path. So again, it's recognized the path. It knows which path assistant you've configured, and it knows which step you want to click on. I wish the screen resolution was a bit wider. Okay. And we can even interact with things like Lightning components. So here we see a custom component. So one of the things that used to pain me was how when you've added products to an opportunity and want to change them, I had to go in each product individually or go off to another screen in 2 or 3 clicks. So what I might want to do here, for example, is change the product in real time and make a change to that and add that to my test case. And in this case, it's understood not only that there's one Lightning component, it knows how that component is built. So we know that it's a component called custom controller demo, has another Lightning component within it. It's got actually a table of line items. And in that line item, we've selected the individual Lightning component within it. So that's all happened for free. I haven't had to tell it those things. It's identified those. And it knows which field I'm on. Now, that's because I've previously mapped it. If I do that as a new field, this is getting to developer stuff now, but if I was a developer, I'd recognize what we call an expression here. So we bind to what the developer has said this quantity field is. So if the developer moves it around, I'll still be bound to that. We call that by aura. But if you're used to other test automation, you can use labels. Labels aren't robust if you've got multi-language, but they work really nicely if you're a single language. You never want to use this, which is what traditional tools use. The Salesforce IDs are totally unsafe to test with. But the name field, if your developers put a name on a field, that's okay, because that's not going to change when the label changes, or they shouldn't do. And if you're really desperate, there's something called XPath, where you can basically configure and select unique rows using the attributes of that field. Okay, so that's a really quick Provar demo. I don't want to go into any more ad hoc stuff. Any last questions before we finish?
Yeah, so every time we talk about automating the use cases in a declarative way, it's using a framework like that.
No, automation is 2 things. It can be code, or it can be using something like Provar. And that can be something where you'd record it. But once you've recorded it once, I can then plug that test script or my pack of test scripts in. I can plug all of those into my CI or CD process. Well, the development team can do that. It helps you achieve DevOps. If you think you're doing DevOps today, if you think you're agile and you're not doing test automation, you cannot be agile. Okay? It's not possible. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. Gracias.